Hi, and welcome to Kalari Lab Online, Science and Secrets. So in these videos, I want to take the opportunity to go through with you some of the background science from a Western perspective and also from an Eastern perspective to try to understand why it is that Kalari is such an effective system. So having practiced Kalari myself for nearly 20 years, I've come to see that there is an increasing amount of evidence coming out of Western medical research that is giving support and giving value, giving a kind of clinical reasoning or a clinical understanding to why it is that Kalari is such an effective practice. Now, one of the big areas of this research and what I want to talk about today is fascia. Now, fascia has become quite a big buzzword in the world of yoga recently. And I want to go into a little detail as to why that is, to why yoga and also Kalari are both very effective systems or methods in which we can work to keep the fascia of the body in good health. So what is fascia? Okay, this is probably something that not all of you have come across before. So here I have my whiteboard. I'm going to try and use that as best as I can to help to illustrate as well as to explain this to you. I apologize, my drawing is not the best, but hopefully it should be helpful to make it more easy to understand. Now, in order to understand fascia, the most simple word I think we can use or pair of words that we can use to understand it is connective tissue. So everything in our body is connected, and it's the fascia that is connecting it. So let's go into that a bit more. What do we mean by that? So the definition of fascia has changed. There was a definition of fascia that existed up until the 60s. And since the 60s, as a result of the work of several people, particularly Ida Rolf and later Thomas Myers. Ida Rolf, of course, was the founder of the Rolfing technique, and this Rolfing method of bodywork has come out of her research. And the second person I mentioned, Thomas Myers, who worked extensively on looking at how the connective tissue gave life to the organs, also how the connective tissue formed lines through the body. So these are the two things that we'll look at when we come on to talking about Thomas Myers' work. Before we get there, I just want to look at first what was the definition prior to the 60s. So prior to the 60s, we considered fascia to be a kind of connective tissue that would go in between other muscles. So if this was my lat dorsi, latissimus dorsi, and this was the top of my trapezius. So we're looking at the area underneath the arm. So the trapezius coming down here, the lat dorsi coming in from either side. Down the center area of those two and underneath the trapezius, fusing into them, we find this connective tissue. And this connective tissue was called the Thoracolumbar Fascia. So this was a word, or this was a name given to the fascia found in this area of the body, so between the lat dorsi, fusing them into the trapezius. This was a name that's used by anatomists prior to the 60s. Well, in fact, it's still used now, but the idea of the fascia was just a thin sheet of contractile tissue. So muscles, as we know, contract. They have within them actin and myosin, and the interplay between the actin and myosin allows for the contraction of a muscle. Of course, whenever I lift something up or whenever I press, I'm contracting the muscle in that area in order to mobilize the limb. So fascia, as well as a muscle, as well as a tendon, has an ability to contract, to shorten, and then to relax. Now, what came later was that this definition was expanded. But up until the 60s, we only considered a very thin sheet of contractile tissue which had not discerned itself into being a muscle, nor discerned itself into being a tendon. We considered it then as fascia. So you find that, as I say, between the lat dorsi and the trapezius, down the side of the body here. You also, on the sole of the foot, so if this was the leg as it's coming down. So we've got our tibia bone. Behind that we have coming in the fibula. They sit into talus, calcaneus, and then the rest of the foot bones going off in this direction. Underneath them, so reaching down from the base of the Achilles tendon, we have here what's called the plantar fascia. Plantar fascia. So that's on the sole of the foot. And when that contracts, it pushes us up into plantar flexion. You go up onto your tiptoes. So if you push up onto your tiptoes, you're contracting this fascia. So here the thoracolumbar fascia, and here the plantar fascia. Two examples of fascia as we considered it to be prior to the 60s. However, as I mentioned before, the work of Ida Rolf initially led to a big transformation in what was considered to be fascia. Now, what came then on, so what then became the definition of fascia after the 60s, we looked instead to find within the body any contractile tissue. So muscles, tendons, and what previously had been called fascia, we now group together as fascia, or for another word, myofascia. Myo from the Latin, meaning muscle. So muscle, fascia, together. The reason that they did this is because Ida Rolf considered there to be a passing of tension through the body. Now, up until Ida Rolf, previous anatomists, when they had made dissections, when they had removed one muscle from the body, they simply cut away the muscle at the attachment points. So, for example, if they were looking to see what happened to the tendons on the hand, they would separate the tendons from the fingertips, and they would take those tendons up, and they would see where they next attached onto. Now, all of our flexor tendons, the ones that we use to close the hand or to bring the wrist up like this, all of these flexor tendons attach onto this point here. This is your common flexor origin. So up until the 60s, the understanding was that these tendons worked to flex the wrist, to flex the fingers, so to close the hand, and they worked up until this point. Here there was an attachment, and then from this point onwards, we considered it to be a separate muscle. Now, what Ida Rolf did, when she got to this attachment point here, instead of cutting through the tissue and separating the tendons off, putting them down, giving them a name, marking down the attachment points, instead, she took the knife underneath and she separated the tendons away from the attachment point, and then they came away with yet more tissue above. So it seemed that there was actually a continuity up through the body, not just simply to one point, but that continued. Now, yes, of course, there is an attachment here, and any tension in this area, in those flexors of the fingers and the wrist, any tension will pass into the bone, yes, but it will also pass on. Now, she did a great deal of work exploring these different lines, and this work was carried on by Thomas Myers. Thomas Myers was a body worker and therapist based in the UK. Now, what together they managed to do was to realize that within the body, these lines actually continued all the way up. And they found different lines. They found on the front of the body, if you were to separate off the long and short flexors of the toes, and you were to follow those up, they would join onto tibialis anterior. Tibialis anterior would connect on through the knee, attaching on the outside of the knee, and from there it would continue up into the quadriceps, into rec fem. Rec fem would then carry on up as far as the AIIS, one of the attachment points on the pelvis, the anterior inferior iliac spine. So what they had was a series of connection points or attachment points that were essentially acting together. So there was a tissue that was passing from one to another and to another and to another. And as it did so, it passed tension through the body. That tension, therefore, could be disturbed. So if you had an accident to the ankle, and there was inflammation in the ankle, let's say you sprained your ankle, then you would get, of course, inflammation around the area of the sprain whilst the body was repairing the damaged ligament. But then what would happen is that tension will pass up through the connective tissue, through the fascia, into tibialis anterior, into recfem, into the pelvis. It would then exert a pull down on the pelvis, which would pull on your on the rec abdominis, the six-pack muscle. That, in turn, would pull on sternalis, a pair of muscles that run up over the sternum. And that would, in turn, pull on the muscle that was attached here onto the mastoid process behind the ear. So that tension will pass all the way up the front of the body. Now, after removing this line, they named it the superficial front line. So this is a shallow line. It's not deep in the body. It's the muscles on the surface of the body. Now, in fact, these muscles, their role is to bring the body forward into flexion. So these muscles in the front, when they contract, they bring the body forward. Now, of course, similarly in the back, we have what's called the superficial back line. Now, the superficial back line originates in the opposite point to the superficial front line. So it originates on the base of the foot, on the tips of the toes. It uses the plantar fascia to cross over the bottom of the foot, then the Achilles tendon to pass behind the heel. The Achilles tendon is attached into gastrocnemius. The gastrocnemius through the knee attaches onto the hamstring. The hamstring attaches onto the sitting bone, the ischial tuberosity, the knobbly bit on your bum when you're sitting. That then passes through and onto the lower part of the spine via the sacrotubular ligament, and then the two long erector spinae muscles take that tension all the way up the back to here in the occipital ridge. It then passes over the head via the cranial fascia and the galea aponeurotica and attaches here onto the frontal bone. So you have a line down the front of the body and you have a line down the back of the body. And these two lines manage your position, your upright position. So if the front line is short, it will bring you forward into kyphosis, as old people are when they're curled over, can be rather. Similarly, the back line, if it's short, it brings you this way. So all about keeping balance between these two lines. Furthermore, I can add just this to say that there's a different type of muscle fiber making up these lines. So down the back of the body, and we'll come back to my drawing again. Down the back of the body, as I say, we have this superficial back line, and down the front, we have the superficial front line. So both lines are relatively shallow in the body. We're not talking about deep muscles here. We're talking about more superficial muscles. So I'll make a very rough sketch for you here. So as we have our body, and we're looking at it now from the side, this leg should be a bit longer. Here we go. As should the arms be a bit longer. I do apologize. So down the back, as I say, attaching from the frontal bone, going over the head, running down the back of the body, and down the back of the legs, we have our, let's put the two legs together, we'll make this easier. We have our superficial back line. Then running down the front of the body, but again attaching here so that you can see that they both cohabit. Actually, no, my apologies, it actually attaches more on the side here. It runs down, the front line runs down the front of the body. So it would be here as well. Yeah? So we have this front line and we have this back line. And these two lines managing our position in this sagittal plane, this forwards, backwards plane. Now, The muscles here in the back line are made up of slow twitch fibers. The muscles here in the front line are made up of fast twitch fibers. And the reason is, the muscles in the back line need to work all day, other than when we're lying down. So we're looking at around 16 hours a day, approximately. Whether we're sitting or standing or kneeling or leaning against a wall, these muscles will have to work to keep us upright. As soon as they stop working, we come down into forward flexion. We come back down into onto the ground. So these muscles are having to work continuously to keep us up against gravity. At the same time, in the front of the body, we have fast twitch muscle fibers. Now, they are not so good at working for such a long time, but what they are good at is responding quickly. And the reason we have them in the front is because it allows us to respond quickly to a danger situation. The fight or flight reflex can be responded, can be taken on and responded to in this front line of fascia. So what it gives us is that ability to kick the leg or to contract the quadriceps quickly and to run away. So the fight or flight mechanism can be managed here in the front line. So here we have fast twitch fibers, here we have slow twitch fibers. And these different fibers work in order to maintain our position as an upright position. Now, at this point, I will say there is also a deep front line. The deep front line is, of course, running much deeper in the body. What the deep front line does is lift us up and forwards like this. So when you make an axial extension, when you pull the spine up, which you will be doing in the elephant position when you lift the chest up and forward, or in the cat position. In most of the positions we are doing this, in fact. When you make that upward lift, you are engaging and contracting the core muscle in your body. That core muscle in your body, believe it or not, originates at the big toe, runs up the inner part of the leg, through the pelvis. It then uses your iliopsoas, so your hip flexor, the muscle you're using to bring your leg up for the kicks, the muscle that you use to lift the leg and therefore to walk or to run. The tension passes through on that iliopsoas muscle to the L3, lumbar 3 vertebra. From there it reaches up and forwards to here, the xiphoid process. And it does that via the diaphragm. So your diaphragm and your iliopsoas muscle, your hip flexor, are in fact joined together. They are one and the same muscle, essentially, which is obviously very important if you think about the co-coordination of walking and breathing, or running and breathing, which is an essential ability for us as humans. The reason we do that so easily, so effortlessly, is because it is one muscular contraction that's required. One line of fascia, one line of continuous contractile tissue. Now, after the diaphragm, it goes over the sternum, it reaches up through the larynx, the pharynx, and indeed comes into the tongue. So your tongue is joined to your big toe, one continuous line through the body. So what we're having there then, if I just draw on the contractile tissue this time, and this is of course coming from both sides. So from the big toe, it travels up on the inside of the leg. It travels through on your iliopsoas muscle. It joins together to become the diaphragm reaching up and forward in the body. From there, we have our larynx and our pharynx, and on the top you have the tongue. So all of this is one continuous piece of contractile tissue running through the body. And this we call the deep front line. Now, when I was studying physiotherapy, we spoke very little of these lines. As I say, the majority of kind of modern medical teaching is looking at that old definition of fascia, the idea that fascia is just a contractile sheet of tissue. It's not a line through the body. It's just an area of contractile tissue that has not discerned, that has not made up and transformed, if you like, built itself into being a tendon or into being a muscle. Instead, it's in that kind of fetal stage, that growing stage, and it's still undifferentiated fascia, so just contractile tissue. Now, as I say, they didn't teach us any about this when I was studying physiotherapy. Instead, they talked about muscles very much as individual tissues joining one point to another. But what we have here and here are three lines, and there are actually other lines, we'll go into that in the next videos. But we have three lines here that are responsible for maintaining our position. One is bringing us forward, one is bringing us back, and one is lifting us up. So together, these three lines of contractile tissue through the body, help to maintain our position and allow us to be functionally successful, allow us to mobilize, allow us to engage and to inquire and to reach into this space around us. So in Kalari, we have a system to strengthen, to lengthen, and to maintain the right amount of tone in these lines. And what I mean by tone is a readiness for action. If someone has had a stroke and their arm is completely flaccid, hanging down, this arm is not really ready for action. It cannot respond. In a similar way, if someone has a very high tone problem, too much tension in the muscles, then they are too ready for action. So what we want is a suitable amount of readiness. As I've referred in some of the videos, I've spoken about sukha and sthira. Sthira, S-T-H-I-R-A, is firmness. If you think of a tree, the way that the trunk of the tree stands very stable, this is our sthira. Then we have sukha, S-U-K-H-A. Sukha is the softness, the ability of a structure to absorb pressure, not to be broken. So all man-made and natural structures have a certain amount of sthira and a certain amount of sukha. If you think of a suspension bridge or of a building in Japan built to withstand earthquakes, it has the right amount of sthira to stand there, but should there be a testing of the foundation can absorb and come back to being in balance. And this is what we call sukha. So every man-made and natural structure, including your spine, including every cell within your body, has a certain amount of these two qualities. These are Sanskrit words, and each one has many definitions. But basically, sthira is meaning firmness, sureness, being rooted, whereas sukha is to be soft, malleable, absorbent. And as I say, you can look online and find many other definitions of these words, which might be more useful to you to understand them. So then, within the body, we have these lines. Within Kalari, we have a system to lengthen and strengthen these lines. And as I say, there are many others, and we will go on to look at those shortly. But we'll leave it there for today. So what I want you to take away from this first of videos that we've had on science and secrets is that within the body there is a contractile system, a system that balances tone, a system that passes on tension to one point or another. Now, it's not just tension that it passes on. And in the next video, we're going to look a bit more at what's happening within the fascia and how it operates. Because it's also transmitting water and it's also transmitting nutrients. And recent research is saying now that it's transmitting light and sound. And this is particularly interesting. So we'll come on to this in the next video. Thank you very much. Hope you found that interesting. Any questions that you may have, please come onto the forum, shoot me with them. I should be able to answer them as best I can. Until then, nalekana.